Quick note before we start this journey. Subscribing helps this channel dig up even more forgotten history. The clicks come first. Before the names, before the tribes, before anyone tells you where this story is supposed to end, there's a sound. Two populations, separated by less than 150 miles of Tanzanian bush, produce a consonant that almost no other humans on Earth can make. And when geneticists finally checked whether that shared sound meant shared blood, the answer wasn't complicated. It was worse than complicated. It was almost total silence between them. The Hadza and the Sandawe live near Lake Eyasi, along the edge of the Rift Valley escarpment. Both speak using click consonants, sharp, percussive sounds produced by a suction motion of the tongue against the roof of the mouth, more like a woodpecker's tap than a vowel. Fewer than 30 languages on the entire planet use clicks this way, and almost all of them sit thousands of miles south, in the deserts of Namibia and Botswana. For over a century, that overlap was treated as proof. Linguists lumped the Hadza, the Sandawe, and the Southern African San peoples into a single family. One people, one origin, scattered by time. Population estimates today put the Hadza at somewhere around 1,000 to 1,300 people. The Sandawe, closer to 40,000 to 60,000. Both swallowed inside a region now dominated by millions of Bantu language speakers. Walking distance apart by East African standards. Not ocean apart. Not continent apart. Neighbors. So when genome sequencing became advanced enough in the 2000s to actually test this shared origin story, researchers expected confirmation. What they got instead did something almost nobody predicted. If the clicks don't prove these two peoples are related, what does the rest of their DNA actually say happened here? For decades, the textbook version of this story was tidy, almost comforting in its simplicity. Click speakers, the story went, were the last living fragment of humanity's original hunter-gatherer population, ancient, unbroken, pushed to the margins of the continent by wave after wave of newcomers. It's the kind of story that sells documentaries and fills museum placards, and for a long time, nobody had the tools to test it properly. The framework came from linguist Joseph Greenberg, who in the 1960s proposed a Khoisan language family, grouping the Southern African click languages together with Hadza and Sandawe under one linguistic tree. The implication was straightforward. If you all click, you all descend from the same source population. One ancient group, spread wide across Eastern and Southern Africa, later fractured and squeezed into isolated refuges. The Kalahari Desert in the south, the Tanzanian Rift in the east, by the arrival of farmers and herders. And those newcomers were real. Bantu-speaking agriculturalists began expanding out of West and Central Africa somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 years ago, eventually becoming the demographic majority across nearly all of sub-Saharan Africa, Tanzania included. Nilotic pastoralists, the ancestors of groups like the Maasai and Datoga, arrived in the Rift Valley on a similar timescale, adding a second wave of newcomers pressing in around the click-speaking holdouts. Under this model, the Hadza and Sandawe weren't just two separate ethnic groups who happened to click. They were framed as living fossils, survivors. The last two chapters of the exact same book, the Hadza especially, became a kind of anthropological celebrity. Their diet, their foraging patterns, their band structure, all of it got held up in documentaries and academic papers as a working proxy for how all humans lived tens of thousands of years ago, before agriculture, before cities, before almost everything. Colonial-era anthropologists had already grouped Hadza and Sandawe together with Southern African Bushmen decades earlier, based largely on physical appearance, a classification method now widely criticized as scientifically unreliable, but one that stuck in the popular imagination anyway. Museums repeated it. Textbooks repeated it. For most of the 20th century, click consonants were treated as close to conclusive proof of deep common descent between every population that used them. That consensus held for a long time, right up until genome-wide sequencing became affordable and precise enough to test African populations directly, without leaning on language classification or physical resemblance as a stand-in for ancestry. But when geneticists finally sequenced Hadza and Sandawe DNA side by side, one detail refused to fit the shared ancestor story. The detail that broke the consensus wasn't subtle. It was written directly across the Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA of both populations, the two genetic records that trace direct paternal and maternal lines back through time, largely undiluted by the mixing of other ancestry. Geneticist Sarah Tishkoff, then at the University of Maryland and now at the University of Pennsylvania, led a landmark study, published in PNAS in 2007, analyzing mitochondrial and Y chromosome variation across the Hadza, the Sandawe, and other click-speaking populations. Think of the Y chromosome as a name passed down father to son, unchanged for generations except for the rare typo. And think of mitochondrial DNA as the same kind of name, passed mother to daughter instead. Compare those two names across two populations, and you can estimate how long ago they shared a common ancestor. Tishkov's team found the Hadza and Sandawe carry strikingly different versions of both. Hadza Y chromosomes are dominated by haplogroup B2, one of the oldest and most geographically restricted paternal lineages documented anywhere in Africa. Sandawe carry a far more mixed profile, including lineages more commonly associated with East African pastoralist groups, the same newcomer populations that had, according to the old story, pushed both tribes into isolation in the first place. Hadza mitochondrial DNA showed deep branching L1 and L2 lineages, with coalescence estimates reaching back over 100,000 years, among the oldest continuously maintained maternal lineages ever sampled in a living human population. Estimates in the literature vary, but they consistently place the split between Hadza and Sandawe lineages tens of thousands of years before either group could plausibly have shared a recent common click-speaking ancestor population together. In some comparisons, the genetic distance between Hadza and Sandawe was found to be as large as, or larger than, the distance between certain Sandawe individuals and entirely non-click-speaking East African neighbors. Old, deep, separate. Here is where it gets complicated. If clicks really meant common ancestry, the Hadza and Sandawe genomes should have clustered close together. They didn't. Linguist Tom Gilderman had already been arguing, on purely linguistic grounds, that Khoisan wasn't a valid genetic family at all, just a geographic label stretched over unrelated click languages that happened to sit on the same continent. The DNA now appeared to back him up. The living fossil story wasn't just incomplete, it was inverted. The two peoples held up for decades as proof of one shared ancient population turned out to be among the most genetically distant human groups ever documented living within a few days' walk of each other. Researchers are careful to frame this as a matter of probability rather than settled certainty. Ancient population history is reconstructed from fragments not photographed directly, but the pattern held across multiple lineages, multiple markers, multiple checks. If shared ancestry doesn't explain the clicks, geneticists had to ask an even stranger question. Did humans invent this sound twice? The first theory on the table was almost too clean. Convergent evolution. Two unrelated populations, separated by tens of thousands of years of independent history, arriving at the same rare sound entirely on their own. Some linguists argued that click consonants aren't some impossible biological fluke, just an efficient, learnable sound that any sufficiently isolated hunter-gatherer population might independently develop or retain under the right pressures. No shared origin required. Supporters of this view point out that clicks are mechanically unusual, not mechanically impossible. They require specific tongue placements and airflow control that are rare, but not restricted to some special anatomical lineage of the human vocal tract. Anyone's mouth can, in principle, learn to do it. By most estimates, only somewhere on the order of 20 to 30 living languages worldwide use clicks as regular, structured consonants, and nearly all of them are in Africa. That makes independent invention a statistically striking claim, if true. Not impossible, but a genuine coincidence stacked on top of another coincidence. And that's exactly where the theory strains. It's one thing to imagine two isolated groups both stumbling onto a single unusual sound. It's another to imagine both of them independently building an entire structured system of click phonemes, full sets of click consonants used consistently grammatically across whole vocabularies, not once, but twice, in the same general region of Africa within the last 100,000 years. Critics working within Gilderman's framework argue that coincidence alone doesn't account for the geography. Nearly every click language on Earth exists in Africa, and specifically in populations carrying some of the oldest, most deeply branching human genetic lineages ever sampled. That kind of clustering, they argue, feels too patterned to be pure chance, which opens a second, messier possibility, one that doesn't require coincidence, and doesn't require the Hadza and Sandawe to be related to each other at all. One that reaches back further than either population's own history, further than Khoisan, further than almost anything linguists had dared to propose. The second theory never tried to connect Hadza to Sandawe at all. It asked a stranger question. What if clicks aren't a shared invention, but a leftover? A fragment of something far older than either population, something present deep in the human lineage before groups split apart at all. This ancient retention hypothesis, associated with linguists including Guldiman and colleagues working on deep African phylogeny, proposes that clicks may be an ancestral human speech feature, one most populations eventually lost, but which a handful of isolated groups simply never let go of. Think of it less like two separate people inventing the same tool, and more like two families in different cities still using the same antique cookware their great-great-grandparents left behind, long after everyone else upgraded. Under this model, Hadza and Sandawe don't need a recent common ancestor at all. They could simply be two separate surviving branches of a much older, far more widespread trait that most of humanity eventually abandoned. The genetic depth backs up the plausibility. Hadza mitochondrial lineages alone push back more than 100,000 years, well before modern language families, as currently classified, could have existed in anything like their present form. Older than Khoisan isn't just poetic. Genetically, it's plausible. A widely cited but controversial 2012 analysis by Perot and Matthew attempted to statistically date the origin of click consonants to earlier than 100,000 years ago, using linguistic diversity modeling. The paper drew significant pushback from linguists who questioned whether spoken sound could be reliably dated that far back using indirect methods at all. And that's the theory's real limitation. It's unfalsifiable in the strictest sense. There's no fossil of a click, no written record of a sound made 100,000 years ago. Only inference, layered on inference, built from the diversity patterns of languages and genomes that exist today. Researchers are careful to frame this as probability, not certainty. Many linguists remain openly skeptical that any spoken sound could be traced back that far with real confidence, calling the whole approach speculative rather than settled science. But here's what the theory does, almost by accident. If clicks really are an ancient, retained trait rather than a fresh, separate invention, Theory 1's whole framing collapses. Convergent evolution stops being the surprising part. Because if both Hadza and Sandawe descend from lineages old enough to reach back before language families as we understand them existed, then the real coincidence wouldn't be two ancient populations both using clicks. The real coincidence would be if two of the world's remaining click-using populations weren't ancient lineages. Not a strange overlap, an expected one. But an even stranger possibility remained, one suggested not by language at all, but by bones and ancient DNA pulled out of caves along the Tanzanian coast. In 2017, scientists sequencing DNA from ancient skeletons in Tanzania and Malawi found something that didn't fit either group's origin story. Geneticist Pontus Skoglund, at Harvard Medical School at the time, later the Francis Crick Institute, led a cell paper titled Reconstructing Prehistoric African Population Structure, analyzing ancient DNA pulled from skeletal remains across East and Southern Africa. Among the samples, individuals from Zanzibar's Kumbi Cave, several thousand years old, whose ancestry traced closely to present-day Hadza, recovered hundreds of miles from where any Hadza lived today. That single detail rewrites the map. It suggests Hadza-related forager populations once ranged across a stretch of eastern and southern Africa far wider than their current homeland, a small pocket near Lake Eyasi. The ancient foragers in question are generally dated to within roughly the last 8,000 years, before the major Bantu and pastoralist expansions swept into the same territory. The implication reshapes Sandawe's place in the story entirely. Maybe Sandawe aren't a failed, distant relative of the Hadza. Maybe they're a descendant population, one shaped by absorbing wave after wave of incoming Nilotic and Cushitic ancestry onto what was once a shared forager base. That would explain the genetic split, without abandoning a distant common root entirely. This is the part the records don't fully explain yet, though. Ancient DNA coverage across Tanzania remains sparse. No ancient Sandawe-specific remains have been sequenced to directly test this model. The theory stays plausible, not proven. None of this is theoretical, though, if you actually walk the ground where it happened. Picture standing on the cracked, pale soil at the edge of Lake Eyasi at dawn. The Yaida Valley escarpment rises behind you, acacia scrubs scattered across dry ground, the lake's alkaline shoreline crusting white with mineral salt in the dry season. Hadza camps here are small, often fewer than 30 people, and mobile, relocating multiple times a year, following game and wild tubers across the same broad rhythm their ancestors likely followed for millennia. In the stillness of a savanna morning, you can hear it. Click consonants threading through ordinary conversation, one of the last living echoes of a sound most of humanity walked away from. A short walk away, in genetic terms, closer to a blink, sit Sandawe villages, where the same clicking consonants are spoken by farmers and herders living an entirely different daily life. Not another continent, not another era, a stretch of dirt road. And this same corner of Tanzania holds Olduvai Gorge, one of the most significant sites in all of paleoanthropology, where hominin footprints and stone tools stretch back over 1 million years, layered geologically beneath the same soil these still living, genetically ancient lineages walk today. Standing there, it's easy to assume you're looking at two branches of the same old tree. The DNA says otherwise. And the final piece of the puzzle changes what otherwise even means. The reframe isn't that Hadza and Sandawe are unrelated, it's that related was never the right question in the first place. Go back through everything, the anomaly, the theories, the ancient bones from Kumbi Cave, and a different picture emerges. The genetic distance between Hadza and Sandawe was never evidence of two separate origins colliding by coincidence in one place. It's evidence that Tanzania itself was never home to one ancient population at all. It was home to multiple deeply divergent human lineages, coexisting and shifting across the same ground for tens of thousands of years. Tishkoff's broader 2009 science paper, over 100 co-authors, sampling more than 100 African populations, found that Africa alone holds more human genetic diversity than the rest of the world combined. Tanzania specifically sits at a crossroads of several of the deepest branches in that diversity. The Hadza aren't a relic of one ancestral population frozen in amber. Genetically, some Hadza lineages represent one of the earliest splits in the entire modern human family tree, a divergence predating the split between most other African and non-African populations ever studied. So the mystery was never really why do two neighboring tribes share a rare sound? It's that Tanzania has hosted so much independent human lineage depth that a shared surface trait like clicking means almost nothing about shared recent history. Surface, depth, two different questions wearing the same word. This means the Khoisan family, as a genetic reality, effectively doesn't exist the way 20th century classification assumed it did, a formal linguistic label built on a false genetic premise. The bigger twist reaches even further. Modern Tanzanians, Hadza, Sandawe, Datoga, Iraku, the Bantu-speaking majority, don't represent one long, unbroken story. They represent multiple, deeply separate human lineages, layered on top of each other in one relatively small geographic space, some diverging earlier than the migration that eventually populated the rest of the planet. Not fractured, layered. The story was never, who are the Tanzanians descended from? There was never a single, the Tanzanians to descend from in the first place. Widen the lens, and this stops being a Tanzanian story specifically. It becomes a preview of what happens every time genetics is finally allowed to test an assumption that was built on language, on appearance, or on geography alone. Assumptions researchers elsewhere have made about shared surnames, shared skin tone, shared customs, only to have direct DNA evidence complicate or quietly overturn the tidy version. Researchers working on similar population studies elsewhere describe a recurring pattern, a story remembered for 100 years and undone in one sequencing run. One geneticist, reflecting on fieldwork in the region, put it simply to a colleague afterward, "We came looking for one family tree and found a forest instead." There's a real irony sitting under all of this. The very land credited as the literal birthplace of the human species, Olduvai Gorge, the wider Rift Valley, is also the land now proving that shared origin is a far messier, more fractured concept than any single family tree can hold. If two populations can share one of the rarest sounds in human language and still turn out to be genetic near strangers, it raises an uncomfortable question far beyond Tanzania. How many other assumptions about who belongs to which group are resting on evidence that was never really genetic at all? Current research doesn't resolve which explanation wins: independent invention, ancient retention, or a once-shared population later layered over by newcomers. Most researchers now treat the three not as competitors, but as pieces that may all be partly true at once, like pages torn from the same much longer archive, each one legible on its own, and still missing the ones on either side. The Tanzanians were never who we thought, and the DNA, even now, is still only telling us part of the truth.